The fear came first, before the laws, before the colonies, before the bells that warned of an approaching sickness. It was a deep, primal fear. Leprosy was a disease you could see. It wasn't like a fever that burned inside or a cough that racked the lungs. It changed the face, it changed the hands, it worked slowly, over years, taking a person apart piece by piece while they were still alive. And that was terrifying. For most of human history, no one knew what caused it. They only saw the results. A patch of skin that lost feeling, a discoloration that wouldn't go away. Then, slowly, the thickening of the skin, especially around the eyebrows and nose. And fingers and toes might grow numb, become weak, and be lost to injury or infection without the person even feeling it. The body seemed to be betraying itself, to be falling apart in slow motion. People saw this and couldn't understand it. Or without the knowledge of bacteria or modern medicine, they reached for the explanations they had. It must be a curse. A punishment from God. A sign of some deep moral impurity. This wasn't just a folk belief. It was written into religious texts and cultural traditions. In the Old Testament, leprosy was linked with uncleanliness, a spiritual stain that required ritual purification. The person with the disease was to be cast out. To live alone, his dwelling shall be outside the camp. This wasn't just a health precaution, it was a religious and social judgment. The disease on the outside was seen as proof of a sickness on the inside. So when people saw someone with the signs, they didn't just see a sick person. They saw a sinner. They saw a walking warning from the heavens. The fear of contagion was also immense and wildly misunderstood. People thought you could catch it from a touch, from breathing the same air, from being in the same room. The idea that it was an airborne plague took root, even though we now know leprosy is actually very difficult to transmit. It requires prolonged close contact with an untreated person, and over 95% of all people are naturally immune anyway. But they didn't know that. They saw a family member get sick, and then another. They saw it move through communities. Their conclusion was simple and direct. It spreads easily, and it is deadly. This combination of visual horror, religious condemnation, and misunderstood contagion created a perfect storm of fear. A diagnosis wasn't just a medical event. It was a social death sentence. It meant you were no longer a part of the community. You were something other, something to be feared, pitied, and most importantly, kept away. The person who was a farmer, a mother, a craftsman yesterday was today simply a leper. That one word erased everything else they had ever been. It became their sole identity. And this fear wasn't quiet. It was loud and active. It drove people to action. It made neighbors turn on neighbors. It made families make impossible choices. A husband might have to send away his wife. The parents might have to abandon a child. The social fabric tore apart around the sick person. The isolation began in the hearts of others long before it became a physical reality. It started with a look of disgust, a step back on the street, a whispered comment. The person with leprosy learned quickly that they were no longer welcome in the world they knew. They were a ghost long before they died. The disease took their body, but the fear took their humanity. It was this fear, more than the bacteria itself, that built the walls of isolation. The fear had to go somewhere. It couldn't just stay a feeling. It needed rules. It needed walls. Society needed a way to formalize the separation, to make the pushing away official. So the informal shunning became law. This process of organized isolation happened all over the world, in different ways, but with the same goal: to get the sick people out of sight and out of the community. In medieval Europe, the rules were stark. A person diagnosed with leprosy often had to endure a ceremony that was like a funeral. They would stand in a church as a priest, read them the leper mass, which was essentially their own death rite. They were declared legally dead, their property was given to their heirs, their marriage was dissolved. They were given a special cloak, a hat, and a wooden clapper, or a bell. The bell was the most important part. They had to ring it wherever they went, a constant announcement of their condition. Unclean, unclean. They were sometimes forced to cry out. This sound became the soundtrack of their exclusion. It warned healthy people to get out of the way, to hold their breath, to not look. It made the invisible wall of fear into an audible one. They were forbidden from entering towns, churches, or markets. They couldn't touch healthy people. They couldn't wash their clothes in a common stream. They couldn't eat with anyone but other people with the same disease. They were pushed to the margins, forced to live in huts on the edge of town, surviving on charity left for them at a safe distance. Their entire world shrank to the size of a lonely path and a secluded hut. As time went on, this ad hoc separation became more organized. The solution was the leprosarium, or the leper colony. These were institutions built specifically to house people with leprosy. At first, many were run by religious orders and perhaps had an element of care. But over time, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, they became more like prisons. Well, they were often built on remote islands or in isolated valleys, places that were naturally cut off from the rest of the world. The goal was quarantine, lifelong, and absolute. One of the most famous and feared was on the island of Molokai in Hawaii. Starting in the 1860s, people diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly taken from their families and shipped to a remote, desolate peninsula. There were no goodbyes. Health officers would arrive at a village, and anyone with suspicious signs would be rounded up. Children were torn from their parents' arms. Husbands and wives were separated forever. They were put on boats and sent to this place, which was described as a lawless tomb for the living. It was a one-way ticket. No one was ever expected to leave. In the United States, there was Carville, Louisiana. And it was the national leprosarium. While perhaps more humane than Molokai in its early days, the principle was the same. Patients were sent there, often against their will. They were given new names to protect their families from the stigma. They lived behind a barbed wire fence. They were citizens of a small, isolated nation of the sick. They could vote in their own elections and publish their own newspaper, but they couldn't leave. A child born to patients at Carville was immediately taken away to be raised elsewhere. The separation was total. The message was clear: you are no longer part of our world. We have created a separate world for you, and you will stay there until you die. This was the machinery of isolation. It was a system built of laws, boats, and fences. It was a deliberate, calculated effort to remove a group of people from society. The personal tragedy of a diagnosis was compounded by the state-enforced exile. To get sick with leprosy didn't just mean your body was changing. It meant your address was changing. Your family was gone, your name was gone, your freedom was gone. You were pushed outside the human family and told to stay there. The isolation was not just a side effect of the disease, it was the prescribed treatment for it. The cure for society's fear was the patient's complete and total removal. A place of exile is supposed to be a place of nothing, and a void. But human beings don't work that way. When you put a group of people together, even in the worst circumstances, they will create a society. And that is exactly what happened inside the walls of the leprosaria. The world outside had cast them out, so they built a new world for themselves. The isolation was meant to be complete, but within that isolation, community found a way to grow. Life inside these colonies was not just about waiting to die. It was about living. People fell in love, they got married, they built homes, they planted gardens. At places like Carville, patients formed clubs, put on plays, and even had a Mardi Gras parade. They had a band and a baseball team. They created a life that looked, in many ways, like the one they had lost. The difference was that here, no one stared. No one flinched away. Everyone understood. For the first time since their diagnosis, they were not the other. They were simply people. In this strange, paradoxical way, the place of their exile became the only place they could be truly normal. Outside the fence, they were a disease. Inside, they were a person. They were a carpenter, a teacher, a friend. They could touch another person without causing panic. They could share a meal without fear of rejection. The shared experience of the disease and the shared experience of being rejected by the outside world created an incredibly powerful bond. They were a family born of tragedy. They governed themselves too. In many colonies, patients established their own rules and leadership structures to maintain order. They knew what they needed better than any distant health authority. They set up systems for distributing food, for settling disputes, for caring for the sicker members of the community. They were not just passive victims, they were active agents in their own lives, making the best of a terrible situation. They found purpose in taking care of each other. The strong would help the weak. Those who could still use their hands would cook for those who couldn't. Of course, it wasn't a paradise. There was still pain and loss and the slow progression of the disease. There was the constant nagging sadness of knowing you were cut off from your original family, from the world you grew up in. Letters came and went, sometimes censored by administrators. A rare visit might be allowed, but it would often take place across a table or through a screen, with no touching allowed. The reminder of their isolation was always there, but the human spirit is resilient. People found joy, they celebrated birthdays and holidays, they played music, they told stories. They found ways to work and contribute. At Molokai, which started as a place of chaos, people eventually organized to build a functioning town with farms and churches. They created a society from scratch, founded on a shared fate. This is the part of the story that complicates the idea of complete isolation. They were isolated from the outside world, yes, but they were not isolated from each other. In fact, they may have experienced a deeper and more profound sense of community than many people in the healthy world. They had lost everything, which meant they had only each other left to rely on. The walls that were built to keep them in also created a space where a unique and powerful form of human connection could flourish. The world pushed them away to be alone, but instead, they found a new way to be together. The plan for total isolation had an unintended consequence, the creation of a new, tightly knit world. The walls of a leprosarium were meant to be impermeable. They were designed to keep sick people in and healthy people out. The separation was supposed to be absolute, but it never really was. There were always some people who were willing to cross the divide. They were the bridge builders, the ones who refused to accept that a disease could create a barrier that humanity could not cross. These were the caregivers, the researchers, and the family members who chose compassion over fear. The most famous of these figures is Father Damien, a Belgian priest who volunteered to go to the colony on Molokai in 1873. He arrived to find a community in despair, lacking basic supplies, medical care, and organization. He didn't just preach to them from a safe distance. He lived with them. He ate with them. He touched them, he dressed their sores and built their coffins. He treated them not as lepers, but as people. He organized the community, helping them build better houses, a proper water system, and a church. He gave them back their dignity. In the process, he contracted the disease himself and eventually died from it on the island. His story became a powerful symbol of selfless love, a testament to the idea that no one was beyond the reach of human kindness. He proved that the walls of isolation could be breached by courage, and he was not the only one. All over the world, religious orders, both Christian and from other faiths, sent volunteers to care for the sick. Nuns, priests, and monks ran many of the leprosaria. While the institutions themselves were instruments of isolation, many of the individuals working within them were dedicated to providing comfort and care. They saw a human being, not just a disease. They chose to live inside the walls with the outcasts. There were also doctors and scientists. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, researchers began to seriously study the disease. To do this, they had to get close to the patients. Dr. Gerhard Hansen, who discovered the bacterium that causes leprosy in 1873, worked directly with patients in Norway. At Carville in the United States, doctors lived on the grounds, dedicating their entire careers to finding a treatment. These medical professionals were another kind of bridge. They saw leprosy not as a divine curse, but as a medical problem to be solved. Their work, their willingness to engage with the disease and the people who had it, was the first step toward dismantling the medical justification for isolation. Then there were the families. While many families rejected their sick relatives out of fear or social pressure, some did not. There are countless quiet, unrecorded stories of mothers who refused to give up their children, of spouses who tried to stay in contact, of siblings who sent letters and packages. They might not have been able to live with their loved one, but they didn't completely sever the connection. They kept the thread of family alive, however thin it became. They fought against the stigma and the rules to maintain a human bond. These small acts of loyalty were acts of rebellion against the idea of complete isolation. These helpers, in all their forms, showed that the separation was not total. There was a flow of compassion, of science, of love that trickled through the cracks in the walls. They reminded the patients that they were not entirely forgotten by the outside world. And they challenged the outside world's fear. By touching the untouchable and not immediately falling ill, they demonstrated that the terror surrounding the disease was overblown. Each act of care was a small chip in the foundation of fear that supported the whole system of isolation. They proved that while a government could build a fence, it could not build a wall strong enough to stop human connection. For centuries, the walls stood strong. Isolation was the only known response to leprosy. But then, in the 1940s, a medical breakthrough started a chain reaction that would eventually tear those walls down. The first effective treatments, the sulfone drugs, were discovered. For the first time in human history, there was a way to stop the disease. It wasn't a perfect cure yet, but it was a start. It showed that leprosy was not an unstoppable curse. It was a bacterial infection that could be fought with medicine. This was a revolution. At places like Carville, patients began to see their symptoms improve. The progression of the disease could be halted. This medical fact directly challenged the entire logic of lifelong forced quarantine. If the disease can be treated and rendered non-contagious, why did the fences need to stay up? The patients themselves became the biggest advocates for this change. They had a newspaper, The Star, which they used to educate the public and fight the stigma. They argued that they were not lepers, But people with Hansen's disease, the medically preferred term named after the doctor who discovered the bacillus, they fought for their civil rights. The process was slow. Fear that has been built up over thousands of years doesn't disappear overnight. But the medical reality was undeniable. By the 1980s, a powerful combination of drugs called multi-drug therapy (MDT) was introduced. This treatment was highly effective, could cure the disease in 6 to 12 months, and made patients non-infectious very quickly. The World Health Organization began distributing MDT for free to patients all over the world. The medical case for isolation was completely gone. One by one, the colonies and leprosaria began to close. The laws mandating forced quarantine were repealed. People who had spent 20, 30, even 50 years behind a fence were suddenly told they were free to go. But coming back was not simple. The world they had left was gone. Their families had moved on. Their homes were gone. Many had no skills to survive in the outside world. And most importantly, the stigma was still there. The disease was cured, but the fear of the disease remained. People who returned to their home villages were often shunned. Neighbors still thought they were contagious. Employers wouldn't hire them. People were afraid to touch them or even eat near them. The physical walls were gone, but the invisible walls of prejudice were still standing. Many former patients found that the only place they felt accepted was back at the colony, with the only community they had known for decades. Some chose to live out their lives on the grounds of the now open facilities, the only home they really had. Today, the fight against Hansen's disease is no longer primarily a medical one. MDT is effective and available. The challenge is fighting the social legacy of isolation. It's about education. It's about teaching people that the disease is curable, that it's not highly contagious, and that a person who has been treated poses no danger. It's about dismantling the word leper and the centuries of fear attached to it. Organizations around the world work not just to distribute medicine, but to help former patients reintegrate into society, to fight for their rights, and to erase the stigma. So, did leprosy isolate people completely? The answer is no, but it came terrifyingly close. Society built a massive global system of laws, walls, and rituals designed to achieve total separation. For many, this system stole their families, their names, and their freedom, pushing them into a profound state of exile. But the isolation was never truly complete. Within the walls, patients built powerful communities, forging new families out of shared loss. And from the outside, a brave few always reached across the divide, offering care, seeking knowledge, and extending love. The final breakdown of the isolation came from medicine, which provided the key to unlock the gates. But the ghosts of those walls still linger. The story of leprosy is a long, hard lesson in how fear can build prisons, and how community, compassion, and science are the only things that can tear them down.